Hey folks, Mark Scroggins with Cindy Hyde and Meera McEwen, also with us, that has had some really good questions. I wanna go back to where we just left off, because I end up with a lot of people that come in and they make these huge leaps that because somebody is an addict or an alcoholic, or other, mental health problems, because somebody is bipolar, but they're properly medicated, something like that, that I know that means that they're a bad parent, or, and I find that to be crap.
That they don't get custody.
Yeah. So, I am sure that you have run across that.
I have. And, just because someone's in active addiction doesn't mean that they're a bad parent.
Right.
However, in addiction itself, addiction can be very selfish.
Absolutely.
And so, might they be more neglectful at times? Does the addiction come above and beyond their family at times, or the majority of the time, yes.
Right.
But oftentimes, once they become sober in whichever addiction they're in, those behaviors start going away, where all of a sudden, they're replacing the acting out behaviors with healthy behaviors, which is spending more time with their children and doing more things. So, in their active addiction and maybe at the highest part of their addiction, they can be not the best parent because they're so heavily into their addiction, but it doesn't mean they're a bad parent long term. And so that oftentimes is a misnomer, and and you've got a spouse that's hurting, and so
right.
they're lashing out too, that you can't possibly be a good parent when you're in your active addiction, and that part of that is true.
Well, and they're seeing it through those particular lenses.
Absolutely.
So like, I'll give you an example. One of the things that I think, that you just mentioned, where, does the addiction come above everything else? So if somebody comes in and is telling me that my husband or my wife, whatever, is a sex addict, and so they're a shitty parent, one of the questions I'm going to ask is, well, is he or she missing the kiddos' games? Are they missing, a presentation that the child is doing? So basically, if it is taking away from what, one would think of anyway, so I'm looking at a person's parental involvement with the child, right? And so if they're missing something to go hook up with somebody on the side, that's an issue. Yeah. But if they're not, just because they are afflicted with something doesn't in and of itself mean that they are not a good parent.
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
Good. So I wanted to make sure that I am seeing that correct. Additionally, when we talk about someone being sober from a drug and alcohol standpoint, very easy to determine that. Either you imbibe or you do not imbibe, right? But that's a good word, right? I haven't used that in a while. I need to use that more. But when we're talking about something with a sex addiction or a food addiction, when you use the term sober, very different definition than what I would use in talking about drug or alcohol addiction. Right. So how do you, when you say sober, how do you define that within that context?
And so we're, just like with food addiction, we're not going to go without food.
Right.
We would starve to death, right? And really, we are sexual creatures.
Right.
Our bodies are designed for that.
Right.
And so, and in most cases, you're not going to completely, stop having sex. However,
right.
Working with a therapist or a CSAT and, recovery program, typically the therapist and the sponsor will help the addicted person create what's called bottom lines. So if, for example, the person is watching porn, multiple hours of the day and it's starting to take over, being able to go to his kids' games or her
right.
kids' games, then that would be put on the bottom line to say this is a behavior that I'm not going to participate in
right.
in anymore. Or if, for instance, they're spending money on prostitution or going out to nightclubs to pick up people, that may be bottom lines that get added to
Sure.
say these are, you won't frequent these places anymore. You won't drive down Harry Hines where the prostitutes typically
right.
are, and so, but what, both the therapist and the sponsor have to help them do is to create top lines, which are things that will replace those bottom line behaviors. And
Okay.
so, going to the kids' games more frequently, or, working out more, things that will give them, the feeling of success, and will also make them feel better about themselves, where, the addiction is so shame-based and they feel so bad about themselves when they're in it. It really, to give them top-line work to do and top-line behaviors to do, replaces those bad behaviors and those rituals.
Okay. So that is, I can understand that. And that's something it's kind of interesting to me. You find a difference with, depending on the severity of the addiction and the addiction history, will determine a lot of the times with a judge whether or not they will say just, you can't drink any alcohol or take any drugs during your period of possession, or say maybe 8 hours or 12 hours prior, as compared to sometimes you get them saying, no, we're going to, fit you with a scram device to make sure that you are not, you're not drinking or drugging, drinking at all.
I wonder if they've ever had a case like that in family law where sex addiction has become something that has to be monitored, and you're shaking your head yes.
Sure.
I would think maybe that is a possibility. I don't know. I'd like to know the answer to that question as well.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think that, that's why, in any addiction, you should really have accountability partners. So in recovery, it's sponsors, it's other people in recovery that have longevity, so that you can learn from them and learn what's healthy and what's not.
Right.
But, in the therapy part of it, the client has, a lot to say. So Patrick Carnes created this process called the 3 circles, where the client gets to have, in those circles, determine what's good behavior, bad behavior, and acting out behavior.
Right.
And so, and there's some other parts to that as well. But it just it gives the client a role in their recovery to say, these are the behaviors that get me in trouble.
Right.
And these are the behaviors that I need to stop in order to not be in my addiction anymore. And so, just like, if alcohol was the issue, they might not ever go to the CVS again that they always bought alcohol from, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or whatever store they were frequenting. And because that would be a bottom line for them. If I go in there, I'm going to get triggered and I might want to drink. And so it's kind of the same thing. They create a plan for themselves with the help of either a therapist or a sponsor to help them get back to a place of these, of getting away from those acting out behaviors and replacing them with better behaviors.
Yeah, I would think the attempts to regulate sex or love addiction would be vastly different. And I don't know if I want to say even potentially inappropriate, frankly, as compared to drug or alcohol, because the whole thing with if you have an injunction against behavior, the whole point and the only reason to have that is because it is placing somebody else in danger of harm. Mm-hmm. And so really easy to understand if you're lit, or, you're loaded and you're driving and you've got a kid in the car, or you're at home and you're lit, the ability to properly care for the child is different as compared to with a sex or love addiction.
But wouldn't it be the same if you're spending 19 hours, you have your possession of your kid, and you're spending 14 hours watching dirty or porn on the internet, and now your kid hasn't eaten, they're dirty, and now they go back to the other parent, and the other parent's like, what do you mean you haven't eaten in
Right.
24 hours?
I don't think you see as much of that to that.
Because maybe you can
to that
control it
extent.
within that cycle. So I guess it's
Yeah, I mean, so
amount
if somebody's drunk enough, trying to make mac and cheese, can be difficult, right? Whereas, somebody can press pause on whatever's going on the movie in their.
But can you?
I don't know. I don't know.
But can you?
Yeah, but just like any addiction, typically the person in the addiction will wake up almost every day and say, I'm not doing this today. Right. And yet they'll do it again and again and again because they don't have the right support system and the right help. And you're exactly right. Yes, in their addiction, they could be neglecting their children in some way. That, just like there can be an angry drunk, there can be an angry sex addict, right? That maybe is even abusive to their child. So like it's circumstantial depending on the case or on the person, you know, how their acting out shows up for them. But yeah, it can have a lot of different varieties of what it looks like and what the acting out behavior is. What, you know, one person may be acting out with. It's kind of like the difference between beer and bourbon. You know, is it, you know, some people can be an alcoholic just drinking beer, and,
Sure.
and you know, another person can, you know, drink bourbon, and that's their drug of choice, and that's how, you know, they stay in their alcoholism, and then others mix the two. So, you know, it's got so many different tentacles, if you will, of what it can look like.
Let me ask this, if it crosses the line here, because one thing that I think you see, like, if someone is a pedophile, they tend to stay in the lane of what their gender preference is. Okay, so if a guy is abusing little girls, he tends to just do that. It is far less where you see someone abusing both sexes. I have never run into this in a case, but I would anticipate that this argument would be at least attempted, is that if somebody is a sex addict, then trying to say that their children are in danger because of the sex addiction. So have you seen that kind of jump made, or have you seen research that would tend to say, you know, with someone being a sex addict, you know, their minor children are at risk?
It would need to be, I would think, investigated to know what their arousal template is. A lot of times, and it's not 100% of the time the case.
Sure.
But if they're, you know, if they were abused as a child themselves, so maybe they were abused at 6 years old.
Right.
Right. And depending on whether it was a male or female that abused them, they may have developed an arousal template for 6-year-old little boys or little girls based
Right.
on the type of abuse they endured. That's one rule of or school of thought. Another school of thought, you know, it's not common, but do they start out in adult sex stuff and then revert to children? I think it's probably a little more rare, but it's not, you know, you can't rule it out. You know, I mean, because, you know, the addiction itself does have to escalate in a lot of cases. So. So I think, you know, doing the due diligence, having assessments run to see what the arousal templates are, you know, if it's part of a custody or divorce case would be probably wise. But again, you know, the assessments are only as good as the honesty. And so
Right.
if the person is dishonest in their assessment, you know, and it may take further investigation by therapists to determine whether or not, you know, that could be plausible.
So we've talked a lot about sex addiction. Let's talk about love addiction and how you differentiate between those two.
Yeah. So, you know, Pia Melody calls it kind of crazy love. And so, you know, it's really truly the addiction to love. And so a lot of times it might show up in, you know, and you see it more in women, although it is common in men too, where sex addictions you see more in men, but it can be common with women as well. But you know, so what happens is that a love addict will either layer one relationship after another, or you know, one person after another, in order to get the fulfillment of love, and it's typically love they did not get in childhood. And so they're constantly yearning to find the love so that they can feel complete. And so so that's kind of the gist of love addiction, and it can cause sexual acting out behavior because they may be having sex to get love. And so even though they may not be a true sex addict, although a lot of times it can turn into that where they're then a sex love addict,
Right.
Because they're using sex to get what they perceive to be love. So I see this with a lot of women that I work with, that their thought process is, well, if I just have sex, then they'll love me,
Right.
And so so it's an ongoing thing, but a lot of times, you know, they have suffered from rejection, neglect, or abandonment as children by their parents, by their primary caregivers, and so they will search for that in their adult life.
Okay. Well, folks, we're going to have a couple more questions coming up after this segment, and then we will be wrapping it up. But this is something that I haven't really seen a whole lot of discussion about, and it is something that is becoming more and more commonplace in my practice, especially with some of the Google experts that I run into every now and again. So everybody stay tuned. We're going to be right back with Cindy Hyde and discussing some more sex and love addiction.